Hello, welcome back to Pondering in Pine Trees. So today we're going to be playing around with lactofermentation, both as a food preservation method and as a way to increase the bioavailability of the nutrients in our food. So if you've never lactofermented something before, you might be a little bit concerned about potentially things going awry, but it's actually one of the easiest way to preserve your food as well as make it more nutritionally available as well as much more healthy on your gut. A full range of enzymes and probiotics. So basically it's pickling without the vinegar. You're creating an acidic environment with a salt brine so that the salt slows down any bacterial or fungal growth, and the vegetables are pickled in their own internal acid. So let's get started. But first thing for us today is really going to be to slice these carrots into an appropriate size to fit in this jar. And if you're like me, you don't really like the tops of the carrots where the leaves were. So first things first, we're just going to slice those off. That one tried to roll away. And then we're going to trim them approximately to the size of the jar, a little bit smaller than the size of the jar that we're going to be putting them in. That way they all fit. And once you have one cut, you can just kind of line them up next to each other to make that process a little bit easier. Pretty close. So these leftover pieces, definitely don't throw those away, especially if you have a compost pit, or if you have a dog that's like mine. He absolutely loves the crunch of the carrots. So next, we're just gonna order these into spears. This process takes just a moment. We're just going to start packing them into our cup. So if you spend a lot of time wild harvesting or foraging out in the woods, lactofermentation is also a great way to preserve a lot of the forest foods that you might come across. Some of my favorites are actually lactofermented mushrooms, which has been happening in Slavic countries for time out of mind, both as a food preservation methodology and, again, as a way of making any nutrients in that food much more bioavailable. And it really does increase the flavor profile on a lot of these foods as well. Something about that little bit of salt and whatever seasonings that you really want to put in with them kind of brings a lot of that flavor of the actual vegetable itself out in a pretty profound way. So we're getting pretty close to full here. So I'm only going to put a little bit more in, and then my pup is going to get very lucky with the extra pieces today. And you can really lactoferment in a variety of different containers. So I'm particularly fond of these ball jars that have the airlock on top. So that's a really easy, convenient way. You can buy those jars at the store for $5 or $6 a piece, and that really does kind of make the process a little more streamlined. So I'll put that to the side for now. Now there is some safety stuff that you want to be aware of for this, namely everything that's in your jar does need to be entirely covered over with liquid. So when you're making your brine, which for us is going to be water and salt with a little bit of garlic, you do want to make sure that the brine covers the top of your vegetables and that none of them are rising. So there's a variety of ways to do this, but anything that is coming above the water layer in these jars is potentially opening up your lactofermentation to mold or bacteria, basically contamination. So everything below the layer of the water is going to be safe to consume. And as a minimum for your brine, you want to be hitting about a teaspoon of salt per cup of water. So I like things just a little bit saltier, and it does also speed up the process just a little bit. So we're dealing with about 1.5 cups of water here. And for us, that's going to equate to just about, let's see, 3/4 tablespoon of salt. So we'll get our measuring cup and our salt out here. It's a little bit more than 3/4 tablespoon, but that's all right. So that's going to go in. And you just want to mix that really, really well. Make sure that all the salt is dissolved into the water before you pour it into your jar. Now, one of the other reasons that I do like these ball jars is they come with, I don't know if you can see it there, but a spring inside the jar. That spring is to hold down the vegetables, puts pressure on them so that they stay below the water line. And that ensures a proper contamination-free fermentation process. If you don't have that, they sell glass weights in stores or online that you can pick up as part of your lactofermentation kit. Or you can also just use a rock. You do want to make sure that it's not a rock that will dissolve in water. It's fairly non-porous. You don't want to use sandstone, and you don't want to use something that will dissolve in the water and leave behind minerals either. I'm particularly a fan of granite. And then you want to boil that rock for a minimum of 30 minutes before you are safe to use it in terms of cleanliness and sterility. So now we have our brine mixture, and we're just going to pour that in the jar here until that water is just above the carrots. Now, carrots are nice because they don't float like a lot of other vegetables do, especially if you have them packed tightly enough in your jar. And then you can see this apparatus here. It's the lid, and these have their own silicone airlock on top, but that's essentially what this is going to replicate. So after I get this screwed on, we're going to fill it with water to about that line, and that allows any fermentation gases to release while also still preventing any contamination from coming back down inside the jar. So a lot of people like to use glycerin, especially if you're fermenting alcohols like mead or beer. But for this process, we can actually just use some of our brine, and just enough so that it's about halfway full. Now, for the rest of this process, time is going to do the work, and usually a minimum of about 3 days. So this is going on day 4. You can start to see some bubbles near the top of the jar. This just got done tonight, and this just now. So these two will get opened up about a day from now to make sure that there's no vegetables floating above the water surface. And you can put them in a cool, dark place. The warmer it is, the faster the fermentation is going to happen, but you also sometimes get not as good a flavor if it ferments too fast. So 3 days would be like the minimum for these bubbling, for that fermentation to really start, and then up to 2 weeks. But I like to open the jars around day 5 and see where the flavor's at, what the texture of the vegetables is, and kind of based on that I make my decision. But usually around day 5 is when I'm happy with my fermentation process for a lot of these vegetables. So if you want to see more wild harvest food preparation methods, more sustainable and fun recipes that you can do in your own kitchen, tune in next time to Pondering in the Pines.